by any means necessary.
And we're going to keep the movement moving on, as they say. We're now happy to be joined by Musa Springer, a cultural worker, host of the Groundings podcast, digital outreach coordinator at the Walter Rodney Foundation, and international youth representative at the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente, and Erica Caines, founder of Liberation Through Reading and editor of the Hood Communist blog. Musa, Erica, thank you both so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And Musa, I'll start with you. I know that you recently got back from Cuba, where the ravages of the blockade that's been going on for decades at this point, of course, at the behest of the United States, seems to be taking its heaviest toll yet in terms of the impacts that it's having on real time on the Cuban people. So I was hoping you could just sort of break down what did you see while you were in Cuba? What are the conditions like? And what do you think we in the U.S., who get so much misinformation and outright lies about Cuba, what do you think we need to understand about what's happening there right now?
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate this opening question because it's important for people to understand the reality right now in Cuba. In the 90s, when the USSR fell, Cuba's economy collapsed and they entered into what they called the special period, which was a completely disastrous economic depression, one of the hardest times in Cuban history. Since about 2020, at the start of the pandemic, Cubans have been saying they feel as though they're in a second special period. I was there for the majority of the month of April and actually just got back a day or two ago. And what they're currently experiencing now, due to the U.S. blockade, the consequences of the pandemic closing their tourism sector, and now mass gasoline shortages across the island, Cubans are now saying that they're in a second special period. And this is really, really significant because this is a very dark moment in Cuban history in which they had to, through revolutionary solidarity and fortitude, really struggle to maintain and to not completely collapse under the weight of the blockade. And so now, what you see is, for example, there's massive oil and gas shortages across the island, like I said, and you have cars lining up at gas stations for 2, 3, even 4 days waiting on gasoline. Because of this, you also have limited transportation across the city. If there's no gasoline, there's less buses running, less people are able to maneuver and to get around the city. The cost of taxis and everything is extremely high because of this. What's more, you have food shortages and rolling blackouts taking place in more rural areas for up to a day at times. And, I think the really big sort of signal that the second special period is upon us is that the Mayday Parade, for the first time since 1994, since the special period, the parade was canceled. And they said that because there's no gas, they're not really able to do a full-scale car procession like they usually do. They're not able to fully, utilize faculties because of the gas shortages. And so instead of having a parade, what you have this week, instead of the International Mayday Brigade, is little or smaller neighborhood-based activities in every neighborhood inside of Havana. And this right here is a really big deal, signaling that there is a shift taking place and that they may, in fact, be in the second special period. All to blame, quite honestly, on the U.S. blockade.
And, as absolutely horrific as it is hearing about the worsening effect of the U.S. blockade against Cuba, Ricky, the way the country was able to survive and endure the first special period may give us an indication as to how they will be able to survive and endure this second period. But it's not going to come without some serious solidarity that I think several groups of people expressed with your recent visit to Cuba. So, can you give us a little bit of your thoughts about how we can do that?
Well,
as you noted, on the beginning of April, on April 4th, members of the Black Alliance for Peace visited Cuba as part of our launch for the Zone of Peace campaign across the Americas. So we launched not just in Havana, but in D.C. and Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And the concept of the Zone of Peace obviously emerged from the 2014 call from CELAC to make the entirety of the Americas a zone of peace. A lot for the same reasons that Devin just expressed, what the blockade is doing to Cuba and sanctions by and large, sanctioning Venezuela, sanctioning Nicaragua, sanctions across the region is doing has led to a crisis of sorts that has undermined sovereignty and self-determination of these nations. So what the Zone of Peace launch and campaign is calling for is a reiteration of the CELAC demands, which calls for sovereignty and self-determination and allowance for these nations to thrive. And so one of the initial core demands from our launch, of course, is to recognize sanctions and the blockade as an act of war, because it is. We can see that it's having drastic effects on the Cuban people. When I was there, I got to see that in real time. Musa noted having to wait for transportation. When we were in Matanzas, we experienced one of those rolling blackouts where we were not sure how long it was going to last. So being able to see that in real time, I think was very significant, not just for me, but also in terms of why we were there to raise that call for the Zone of Peace. Because currently, I just seen a clip of Liz from Belly of the Beast questioning about Cuba being on the state terrorism list. And the response was, oh, well, Cuba just had a whole bunch of human rights violations, nothing specific. They couldn't name anything specific or give any examples. But it's under that fallacious guise of human rights that the U.S. is allowed and Western nations are allowed to get away with undermining the sovereignty of these nations. So what the Zone of Peace is also doing, and this campaign launch is also doing, is lifting up a people-centered human rights, which is how we can maneuver through the rhetorical hypocrisy of the West's use of human rights. Because it's a politics of being whole. So this framework is an approach that views human rights as an arena of struggle that, when grounded and informed by the needs and aspirations of the oppressed, becomes part of a unified and comprehensive strategy for the decolonization and radical social change. So when we're talking about human rights and human rights atrocities in Cuba, that was not anything that I had experienced or witnessed or even heard of from the Cuban people themselves, but it is something that's being repeated in an effort to negate or undermine the possibility of Cuba seeing out the revolution.
Yeah, and Musa, these principles that Erica is highlighting for the Zone of Peace campaign, the emphasis on sovereignty and self-determination. I mean, these are things that any country, any nation would want, but it's something that Cuba has been steadily denied for years because it refuses to kowtow to the whims of U.S. imperialism, and because Cuba has the audacity, with the support of its people, to carry through its own socialist path and its own processes and institutions of democracy. And so these attacks on Cuba also extend to those who wish to show solidarity to Cuba and who seek to travel to Cuba to have person-to-person exchanges and who simply seek to come back to the United States to tell the truth of what is happening there and to pierce through the lies of this government and its corporate press. And there recently was a pretty sizable youth delegation that went to Cuba for May Day. I know there were labor organizers and just activists and folks of all types that were able to be a part of this. And some members of this group on their way back into the U.S. were actually stopped and screened detained and harassed by customs. And this is something that is not at all uncommon when people come back from these types of trips from Cuba and Nicaragua and countries like this. And Musa, I know that you and Erica were not a part of this delegation, but I mean, what does this incident, this harassment, how do you factor it into the reality of what's happening on the ground in Cuba and how there's this feeling that they may be entering this second period and how Washington seeks to react to that?
Well, I think first off, and this is a really important question, I think first off, people have to understand that restrictions on travel do not come from the Cuban side. They come from the U.S. side. And here there's this misconception, which I have, people have told me repeatedly, oh, I didn't know Cubans allowed Americans to enter the country. I didn't know Cubans let Americans travel there. Is it safe for Americans to travel there? Which is almost a laughable question. We have a mass shooting almost every day here in the U.S. at this point. But in fact, the restrictions and the difficulty on travel is from the U.S. side. We're taught in school that Cuba is, quote unquote, a dark island and they're limited access and the rest of the world doesn't know anything about Cuba. And it's only Americans. Cuba is actually a top tourist travel destination for Canadians and people in London and Russia and many countries. So I always like to upfront point out that it is just specifically people from the U.S. who have these political hurdles and reservations for traveling there. But, I think that the point is the U.S. fears the fear of a good example. And so for people to go to Cuba and to speak with Cubans who can tell you very soberly where their problems emanate from, who can point out to you in granular detail the multitude of ways that the blockade is impacting them, for you to see with your own eyes that even despite this blockade, there's a sense of community and love and solidarity amongst the Cuban people, that there's thriving cultural institutions like the National Yoruba Association, Rumba from Los Muñequitos de Matanzas, that there's a vast grassroots organizing initiative from groups like the Red Barrio Afrodescendiente. For if more and more and more Americans, not just those who are on official brigades and delegations, but including people who quite literally just want to travel there for tourism, the more that those of us from the U.S. can go and see these things in person, the more of a thorn it is in the side of these imperialists who have maintained this blockade for 65 plus years now, give or take. And so it mirrors perfectly the sentiment on the ground. At this time, I mentioned that it's a second special period of sorts. You have more Cubans leaving the island currently than actually immediately following the revolution. And this is a function of the blockade. They want to drive Cubans out of the island and have Cubans feeling as though there's no options internally in the island. And then, of course, we know that when or if they come to the U.S., they're treated horribly. They're, if they're not like a white landowning Miami Cuban, they're pretty much cast to the streets of Florida in most cases. And Biden has even ratcheted up his anti-Cuban policies of immigration. He has new policies essentially specifically targeting Cubans, Nicaraguans, and Haitians. And so, the sentiment and this idea that, and even recently yesterday, many of the brigadistas from the Mayday Brigade, right now there's thousands of brigadistas all around the world actually in Cuba still, but some who returned yesterday were held up at the airport for several hours, and I think were just released this morning, if I'm not mistaken. This is an intimidation factor. They want to intimidate not just tourists and non-political travel, but also those of us who go very explicitly and publicly in solidarity with the Cuban people and revolution.
Absolutely. We're going to take a quick break on that note here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. We'll be right back, so please stay with us.
By any means necessary.
Welcome back to By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackman, here with Jackie Lukman. And as always, we are your guide for connecting the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. And we are back continuing our conversation with Musa Springer and Erica Caines, on the ground update on what's happening in Cuba. And Musa, there's another aspect of this that I wanted to raise, which to me is just part and parcel of this incessant, decades long running propaganda campaign against Cuba. And there's this viral video that's going around of this black Cuban woman describing the revolutionary heroes of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara as racist, and really sort of picking up on this narrative that I think has been weaponized against Cuba for a while, but it seems to have taken on a new intensity in the last couple of years. And that is, these accusations of racism inside Cuba. And, Musa, I know that you're someone who works, on the ground with different Afro-Cuban groups and things like that. And so I'm just curious your estimation of what this woman is saying in this video, and how it feeds into these, tropes and misconceptions about Cuban race that have been hanging around for a while.
Yeah, definitely. And, I'm going to actually keep my comments kind of brief because Comrade Erica on the phone actually, I think, has some in-person experience with this specific individual you're referencing.
Oh, wow.
But as someone who has now going on 7 years engaged in direct grassroots organizing with the Red Barrial Afrodescendiente, which for those who don't speak Spanish is the Afro-descendant neighborhood network, as well as several other organizations and groups and projects across Havana and Matanzas, I can't help but laugh when people try to use Black Cubans as some weak example of how evil the Cuban government is, or try to claim that Black Cubans, especially hate the government. The opposite is true. That could not be further from the truth. If you know any basic tenet of history at all about Cuba and the Cuban Revolution, you know that the people who primarily benefited the most from the revolution were Black Cubans, Cubans living in rural areas, and women, Cuban women, of course, many of whom are Black Cuban women, right? And so you have this video currently going viral of this Black Cuban woman, I'm assuming in Miami, who for years now has been publicly protesting against the quote-unquote evils of communism and calling Che Guevara and Castro racist. There's no validity to any of her claims. She's just making these weird emotional arguments. In truth, what's happening on the ground is you have a massive grassroots sector of organizers, activists, and popular educators who see the work that they are doing, the anti-racist work that they are doing, not antagonistic to their revolution or their government, but actually in partnership with it. They see that their state has a role and that what they are doing is just to continue the revolution. Some of them even call it a revolution within the revolution. And something that Maritza Lopez, the leader of the Red Barrial, often reminds me is that when we talk about race and racism and blackness in Cuba, you have to keep in mind that the revolution is only 60 years old, give or take, while colonization and slavery date back 300 to 400 years. So it's not like the problems of race are going to suddenly disappear overnight because there's a revolution, but certainly by having this revolutionary government, Diaz-Canel actually recently even created a massive national program to combat racial discrimination. And the government essentially has no structural or vertical racism within its ranks. You have issues of social racism amongst people, which even themselves are extremely limited because racism is so harshly outlawed in Cuba. And so, I'll pass the mic if I can to Comrade Erica over there. But these claims are bogus and they just don't match up with the reality on the island whatsoever.
Yeah, Erica, go right ahead.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that the sort of since 2021, since July, really, there's been like a push to dominate the public discourse using the identity of Afro-Cubans as a weapon, right? So there's no account, like Musa said, taken for the relationship between Afro-Cubans, the Cuban state, and the ongoing process post-revolution. And much of it is because, as we determined from that attempt in 2021, that much of this is USAID and NED backed. Like, these are programs and institutions that have been developed, civil society institutions that have been developed within these nations to sort of latch on to, I guess, these sort of popular movements, tokenisms, and push that as a way to sort of disrupt that revolutionary process. Because it's not just happening in Cuba. Nicaragua is attempting to do that too, with using people in blue fields or Africans on the coast to sort of have some, connection to what they see as Black Lives Matter, even though that is in context not at all the same. They don't even deal with police in these nations in the same type of ways. But these U.S.-backed institutions, these NED and USAID that have these civil society groups in these nations, have been able to sort of weaponize the appeal of that Black Lives Matter and the empathy that people feel for the Black Lives Matter movement happening here, and sort of try to push it into these nations where those are not really the existing conditions. Like, yes, they might be dealing with some prejudice, but structurally and systematically, they are not dealing with racism in the same way. And because of the revolutions that they had, they are more equipped to actually organize and deal with those prejudices that may pop up and the societal issues that derive from that. But that is not in the same way as here. And when Musa mentioned that I have maybe a personal experience, in November 2021, a bunch of us went back to the embassy because there was reporting that there was going to be another attempt, like the one in July, to sort of not overthrow, but push attempts at a coup, or push, disdain for the Cuban government using Afro-Cubans. And when that call was made, we all went down to the embassy in support of the Cuban government. And across the street, there were maybe 3 or 4 Cuban people that were, anti-Cuban government, Cusanos, as people like to call them, that were anti-Cuban government, that were protesting across. And there was this one Black woman, and she left from across the street and came over to us and started a conversation with me because maybe I was the only Black person. Sean, I believe you were there as well.
Yeah.
And we had a back and forth. Right. Remember, that was a very intense conversation where they said that their family, their father fought in Angola, and that Black people have more rights here than they do in Cuba. It was a very, very intense conversation. So to see her years later be viral, saying the exact same things, you could see that there is really this intention to push back against the propaganda that's coming from us, who has been to Cuba, who has been in conversations with Cubans, who has been, engaging with Afro-Cubans around what their life is and what the struggle is and what the post-revolutionary process looks like for them and how the blockade has impacted them. And we've been able to leave Cuba and come back and tell the truth about Cuba. And I think because the U.S. is now losing, or having the feel that they are losing the propaganda war, they're intensifying it in this way. So Cuba's still on the state-sponsored terrorist list. Now you have this lady who's gone viral as an Afro-Cuban to depict her lived experience as an Afro-Cuban, to say that we've all been lied to about Castro and Che, and everything that we went to Cuba to learn is absolutely not true. So they really are going to make these attempts because they're losing the propaganda war, especially as they remain one of 2 nations to push for the blockade year after year.
And I think, too, if I can briefly really add one other point onto that, one of the things that Zuleika Romay, who is at the Casa de las Americas in Cuba, she's the head of the National African American History and Studies program for the country. The difference she makes between racism in Cuba, quote unquote, and racism here, she calls racism in Cuba a social problem of the mind because there's no laws or structures in Cuba that are designed with the intention of harming Black people, or anybody for that matter. There's nothing, there's no equivalent to the police here or to certain racist laws. They have nothing that is designed to harm a certain group of people. And the other aspect is that the blockade itself makes this anti-racism organizing and work that's taking place even harder. It suffocates their ability to organize against racism or homophobia. And even despite that blockade, they're still making massive strides and progress. But you can imagine that whatever national resources and funds and money is available, only a tiny percentage of that can be allocated towards anti-racism work when you're being limited and suffocated economically, and you have to really put all of your attention towards these problems created by the blockade. And so it turns this anti-racism struggle into a secondary or periphery struggle for some of the Cubans. And so, once again, we can implicate the blockade in all of this. And it's so funny that Afro-Cuban voices like hers are uplifted and go viral. But you have people like myself or Liz Oliva and so many others who are both Black and Cuban. In my case, only in part. But, we don't get the same airtime and shine and to tell our experiences and our reality the same way that these other gusanos do.
Yeah, absolutely. And another aspect of the difference between life in Cuba and life in the United States is just the participation of the people in the Cuban government in a very real, intangible way. And that's also something that brigadistas experience very frequently when visiting Cuba. And I'm wondering, Ricky, Erica, if you can speak to that a little bit, just the level of access and participation and feeling of ownership in the government, in the process, and in the revolution that people in Cuba have, that even visitors to Cuba can experience.
Yeah, I can say that people have been, since I've been returning from both Nicaragua and Cuba, people have sort of emphasized, why go there to these countries when we have our own issues? And I can say for sure, had I not gone to these nations, I wouldn't even know how to deal with our issues or even really have a more grounded view of or framework of how the best way to deal with these issues, because I've been able to witness these revolutionary processes. These are people who are organized on a block by block level, who are not single issued organizers. They understand themselves as part and parcel of the revolution, and as such part and parcel of the government. They have a say. They encourage that sort of popular and political education from youth onward. And to see that level of sophistication, obviously because it's post-revolution, they have set that up in a way that they can participate in that way. But to see that gives me a deeper or a better understanding of our conditions, because we are siphoned off in those single issue sort of organizing that we don't really understand the primary and secondary contradictions of our fight. So we're all over the place. We're fighting for trans rights here, and we're fighting for Black rights here, and we're fighting for housing here, and not seeing these things as a collective fight for workers. And I think that that's the advancement and that I witnessed in Cuba, that they're able to see these things as one issue collectively. Like when we visited the Afro Diverso group, which is a group of Black, trans, and queer Afro-Cubans, when we visited them and heard those conversations, that's not the conversations that I hear amongst the groups that I'm able to participate and engage with that are organizing. They're talking about, they're not so much fighting for their right to be trans, but fighting for their right to be themselves as trans people, but as workers within the community. Like they don't want they don't see it as something, a separate site. They see it as something where they can live their full lives, but be able to live their full lives so that they can participate in the ongoing post-revolutionary struggle and not be exempt from it. And I think that that was a distinction for me that I was really taken aback by, because it really is a collective organizing perception that they have and framework that they carry out and follow through. And it really is a community-based organizing that focuses on neighborhoods more so than this sort of elusive conversation about communities that we are often having here in the U.S.
Yeah. And, you know, Musa, just to state the obvious, I mean, what we've discussed here is how, you know, so much of just the basic truth about Cuban society, about socialism in Cuba, about race in Cuba, and about how it really operates is simply not known by masses of people here in the United States. Indeed, that information is hidden and now demonized if someone has the audacity to speak it. And so from a movement standpoint, and particularly when we talk about the issues that do face poor working and oppressed people here in the United States in this juncture, why do you think that it's important that we keep an eye on Cuba and that we're aware of what's happening in Cuba, how conditions are impacting people on the ground, and what value does that have for our own struggle against the capitalist system here inside of the U.S.?
Well, you know, it's not just that this history is not known, it's actively suppressed. If we see the battles that are taking place over what can be included in history books here in the U.S., imagine what is discluded and excluded and suppressed about other places around the world and the U.S.'s role in those places. So first and foremost, this political education is our responsibility because we live in the U.S., the country that has placed this longest blockade in history on Cuba. Second is because of the examples, the multitude of examples that Cuba provides. You know, many people, young people interested in going to medical school here in the U.S. but can't afford it, don't even know that Cuba offers free medical school to all Black and brown Americans. And the only requirement is that when they return, they work in neighborhoods that need support the most. People don't know that Cuba provides medical and educational training for teachers and popular educators. They don't know the many, not just historical lessons from the revolution, but the actual tangible material support Cuba offers to us here in the U.S. And so by continuing this political education and putting a focus on learning and teaching all of this stuff about Cuba, we're provided roadmaps and examples, guidance for our own movements here in the U.S. Many of the problems we face here, Cuba has overcome or is working towards overcoming. So why wouldn't we want to know all of this, right? So that's my very brief version of my answer for that.
Absolutely. Well, Musa, Erica, we want to thank you both so much for joining us today. We're going to leave it there and move to a break here on By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C. We'll be right back, so please stay with us.